Two, one. Professor Jim Hendler. Thanks for being here again. This is awesome. Welcome to the Doug of Troy. That's currently what I'm calling it still, but it needs a new name. I basically have two questions, and you run with them as long as you want.
Sure.
The first one is, whenever I get in a conversation with someone, this has been a lifelong thing. We try to discuss and decipher and define what intelligence is, just in the world of people and humans. What is intelligence to you, and what is artificial intelligence? Because I find no one that can agree.
You're right that it's something that's really hard to get agreement on. In fact, we in the field of AI have spent a long time trying to do it. But of course, sometimes defining almost anything is hard. My colleagues in physics will say, well, you don't have a definition. I'll say, give me the definition of physics, and then I'll do it, and you end up with long conversations there too. I think the key is, I used to do a experiment with my students in intro artificial intelligence classes, where I asked them to sort of say, what would they consider sort of the minimal thing that they would call intelligent? Is it a clam? Is it a dog? Is it a cat? Is it a bird? Is it a this? And then what we do is try to kind of put those onto some sort of continuum, right? So pretty much everybody will agree a human has more intelligence than a clam, right? Most would agree a dog has more intelligence than a clam, and most would agree a human has more than a dog, although you might start getting into some subtleties when you start getting into different things that something can do and another thing can't do and stuff like that. So mostly we end up in some variant of, when we look at humans, we see a lot of behaviors that are the ones that seem to separate us from the things next down on that list: dogs, horses, monkeys. And so it's really focusing kind of in that space that we tend to talk about, the starting place for intelligence. Then you can kind of move backwards from that. So, is a crow using a tool intelligent, or is it just more intelligent than some other bird or some other thing? And then you get into, is intelligence what's inside your head or what you're doing with what's inside your head? I tend towards the latter. So I don't think the mechanism is what defines intelligence. I think it's the behaviors and abilities to communicate, to have this kind of conversation, etc. So that's kind of where I come down on. And there's a tradition in artificial intelligence going all the way back to Alan Turing, who was one of the inventors of the field of computing. Anyone who saw the Imitation Game movie that was about Turing, Turing sort of said, it seems like if we had a computer and a human, and you had to guess which was which, and it's more complicated than that, but we can talk about that later if you want. That would be the way to tell whether a computer is intelligence, its ability to communicate. Nowadays, we go a little further than that, because we are seeing chatbots and things, and so we have to say, is it general communication? Is it a conversation? Is it an unlimited conversation? Does it also include the ability to, so I'm looking at you as we speak, and I can pick up some cues from that. So if I was just typing to something and it was typing back, is that good enough? Ability to navigate through the world, all those things. So it's a pretty complicated thing to try to get a precise definition.
And it sounds like it's gotten more complicated, where we're not just talking about horses and clams and us versus them.
Right. So philosophers have spent a long time arguing about intelligence, but mostly on level of, are humans different than things? At what point could something be conscious? Things like that. In the past 50 years, with the advent of machines being able to conceivably enter this conversation, that starts to be where the philosophers start to part into a lot more areas, and then you've got people who are building things. And I used to say that I would worry about that when it became something I actually was worried about, that computers could be intelligent enough that I have to care. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're converging on some capabilities where we are going to have to look at some of this. And the one thing I would say is that there's a tendency to think of intelligence as a light switch. This is intelligent, this isn't. But if you think about the discussion, the clam to the dog to the horse to the monkey to the human, there's some kind of continuum in there. So saying computers may end up being able to show some capabilities somewhere in that intelligence continuum doesn't really surprise me at all. In fact, I'd say we're already there. It's just hard to say precisely where. But I think when you start saying, are they going to be able to approach and even exceed humans, then we're going to have to start getting into some much more careful conversation about what we're talking about.
You said you used to not think about, you weren't concerned about.
Yeah. So,
but now, when did you start to become concerned?
Right. So in the past past decade, about several AI techniques that have been around for a while have really started to come together. Have gone in technical terms, they've gone through the knee and the exponential curves. If you ever look at a mathematical curve of 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. If you kind of draw that on graph paper, you see a point where it suddenly looks like it starts to go up very quickly. That's called the knee and the exponential curve. And we've seen a lot of the learning technologies, the data-based oriented technologies, things like that. So what a lot of people call machine learning, deep learning, things like that, have really made a big change. And then when you use those technologies underneath all of the kind of text you can get out on the internet, reading Wikipedia, things like that, that gives you another whole level of things you can do. So between, the Watson program that suddenly beat the world's experts at Jeopardy back in 2011, some of the things we're seeing with self-driving cars. So suddenly you have something that's out there, and no one really thinks the self-driving car is intelligent in the sense of thinking carefully and things. But driving cars is something only we've been able to do for a long time.
It seemed like it would a different planet. In my lifetime, the idea of a self-driving car seemed like impossible. I had no idea how any of that could potentially work. And then, of course, the advent of the internet, everybody started talking about, AI, we're going to have things that are just going to run in your life. Your computer's going to run your life. It still made no sense to me because the context of my experience, and I guess most human history experience, is just everything's mechanical. So the idea, I still don't really understand what software does. I'm a dummy. I don't understand all those zeros and ones. Is that what this all breaks down to? Is zeros and ones, and that's somehow going to be intelligent and run our lives?
Well, again, so let me not buy into run your life yet, right? There are a lot of intelligent entities that you work with on a day-to-day basis. All your friends, your parents, kids, whatever, right? Those are intelligent things that you interact with on a day-to-day basis. I'm not sure in most cases whether you'd say they run your life. Some cases they might.
I don't know if you've met my friends or family. Yeah. Well, let's not throw around intelligence too much. You haven't met my friends.
Right. But let's not talk about it. But certainly they're intelligent compared to what's available on your cell phone right now. So the fact that you can go out and Google for all sorts of things and bring new things in really changes a lot of your interactions and conversations and things like that. But the computer isn't telling you what to do, right? Again, there may be cases where in a particular interaction, just as we've always had machines that sometimes tell us what to do. When I come up to the toll booth, there's this little light that tells me whether I can drive or not. It's not actually physically controlling my car. It's just telling me, if you drive now, you're either going to break something or you're going to get arrested or whatever. And so, we're used to living in a world constrained by a lot of mechanical things. And as you say, now we have these things happening, software, but they still have to have some way to enter our world to impact us. And a lot of that comes through people doing things, interactions. So a lot of what I see as really crucial to the near and even into the foreseeable future is how humans are going to more and more interact with these entities rather than them running our lives, them taking over. I'm not too concerned about super intelligent machines right now. I'm much more concerned with unintelligent people as a threat.
And most people, I guess, the unintelligent people. So that brings me a sense of calm. I read the majority of your book, like 80-something% through, and that was kind of the message: is like, hey, don't panic. they're going to have to still work for us, and it's kind of a symbiotic relationship, is what I
work
gathered.
For us, work with us. But, already, if, you do tax calculation, I can't believe you would think about doing that without a calculator.
Correct.
But the calculator is a superhuman number manipulating device, right? Yet no one seems to have no one recently, because in the very early days of some of the early types of computation, people were scared of these things. But there's really no one who's walking around saying, oh no, I think your calculator is going to take over, right? It's when things start moving into spaces that have been traditionally human that we get concerned. And then sometimes we just have to think back a little bit and say, well, but wait a minute, was driving a car really such a big deal, right? Isn't the big deal figuring out where to go? Isn't the big deal figuring out what to do when you get there or why you're getting there? The driving is really a fairly mechanical stuff. It seems to me that if you had a car that was built for a dog, you could train the dog to drive around without hitting stuff, right?
I guess so.
Back when people mostly ran horses, they trained the horses to get them places without bumping into things and running into each other. And, horses have been pretty smart about running around without people on them for quite a long time. But again, so what made the horse plus the human a different system than the horse alone was the human being able to tell the horse where to go, to direct it, to change its behaviors, which is what we'll be doing with the autonomous vehicle. We're not. So the fact that cars could, in a sense, get an intelligence to the level of running around without hitting anything seems mythical and magical and scary. But in reality, when you think about it carefully, it's not a very smart thing to do. It's not really, doesn't seem to take a lot of intelligence to say, if something is in front of you, hit the brake. Right. There's a lot of subtleties, and that's why people still have accidents. And, someone steps off the curb right in front of you, you have to make a split-second decision about what to do. And it's not clear the self-driving car couldn't do that better than you could in terms of the speed. But the rules, the how do you decide what to do and things like that, those are where the hard problems are and where a lot of the arguments are these days. Now move to something like, though, again, having this kind of conversation, thinking about what's important, what do we want to talk about, right? That's very different than just saying, read me a bunch of stuff on the web.
Alexa, open this. Google Home, do this, right? Like it's the subtleties of being a human that...
Yeah, so, your podcast would be kind of boring if your podcast was to sit here in front of a computer and just say, read me what's on this page, or can you find something about that? It's the ability to synthesize that material, to process it in a way that's interesting to us as humans to discuss. I'm having a conversation with you, but also aware that there may be other people eventually listening, not synchronously. So I have to think about whether I need to define some terms that you could interrupt and ask about, but they might not be able to. Things like that. That's the complexities of this intelligence stuff that's at the high end of the intelligence continuum.
That's a dream right now, though, a computer being able to do that.
Right. We're not there. We're not there yet. It's unclear to me. We're very close. Now, a computer that could simulate some of that, you could say, put together a 5-minute presentation on artificial intelligence based on what you could find on the internet. That's within capability now with a little bit of work and very close to being something that you'll be able to, ask Alexa of 5 years from now to do. But again, how intelligent is that if you're the one who has to really come up with what you wanted to discuss, things like that?
Your book, there was a part of your book that did bum me out, and you did just mention Watson in 2011 on Jeopardy. And I feel like maybe that was our calculator moment. How you describe people that first saw calculators like, what is this? This is terrifying. I don't get it. But I feel like in 2011, that was it. As you suggested, it started to do, a calculator did things that people normally did, and all of a sudden, here's Watson. You only ever saw people on Jeopardy, and all of a sudden this machine was marking them. And I had no idea what Watson was at the time, and it wasn't until the disappointing part of your book is like, basically it's just Wikipedia.
Well, it's more than Wikipedia, and it is a complex thing, but that said, yes, it's it's carefully processing a lot of data to figure out a specific answer to a contrived question. Now, we have since then, I've been working with IBM. IBM has worked with a lot of other people to look at how do you extend Watson to do things that might be more relevant to real problems we have. So I have a big project looking at how to use some of the technology that's evolved from Watson to help people with health and health management issues, things like that. How do I, what can I do to keep my, someone who's pre-diabetic, how can they find the best information for them to how to prevent becoming diabetic? Right now, there's a lot of very generic information out there. But, if I can sort of question it and interact with it, so that's where the Jeopardy moment comes in. I can start asking questions like, well, I have a lot of trouble losing weight. Is there a different way I can reduce my diabetic risk? Something like that. That becomes a much harder thing to do than just to say, Fred Smith, right? Or who is Fred Smith?
Right.
Right. What is, try to do a little more exercise of the following kind, which would work because I know your lifestyle has these abilities to put this kind of timing in, right? It's a different thing, but still it's mostly going to be pulling things from existing knowledge, pulling things from things people have figured out and written. So the machine didn't write Wikipedia, it read Wikipedia, and that's the thing. But there's a level to something you said, which actually is very much in the history of AI. That's an important point not to miss, which is most of the time when people find out how these things work, they're kind of disappointed. They go, that's not intelligent.
Right.
If I explain to you how the program that beat the world's best Go player actually works, you would look at it and say, all right, that's pretty cool. I get how it plays Go, but here I thought it was smart. Or again, the one who played Jeopardy, the one who helps your doctor, whatever. Because we have a tendency to think of these things in human terms. When I sometimes say, if I told you somebody was a pretty smart doctor, really, really an expert, right? And asked you, do you think he can read? Do you think he can tie his shoes? Could this person, likely solve simple problems? You have this whole package that comes with the intelligence. With the computer, those things are separated and separable, and we haven't learned how to put them all together again yet. So we may even get really good capabilities in some of these areas, but it's the ability to do it, personalize it, synthesize it. I got great tax preparation software, but people still need people like you who can help with those cases that aren't the really easy, obvious case and things like that, which is brought into them. The specializations to an individual's case, things like that. Those are still really hard, and we haven't learned how to do a lot of that with the computer yet.
Yet. That's where I keep hearing when anytime I read about AI technology, it's yet. Like we can see that where just even 10, 15 years ago, I didn't hear the yet. I didn't understand the yet. And I couldn't see it. It's like, hey, I remember 1997, I think was the first time I really got on AOL, and I was like, what is this? And then started hearing all the buzzwords in the media, like, hey, you're gonna do all your shopping here. You're gonna have home delivery for your groceries. You're never gonna go to a store again. You're never gonna have to do that. You can just talk to people in Texas. You can talk to people in China. None of that made sense to me. And then it was over the progression of the years, like, oh, okay, I get it now. And then there's still the yet. There's still more to come. There's still more to come. Mm-hmm. Is that where we are with AI as far as the internet, say, 97, when I first sat down, to where we are now, where it's just in your life? Like,
sure. Yes, I think that's what you're going to see. And some of it subtly. So, again, there's lots of things you're interacting with now that may or may not be using AI technology. Will get better as the technology improves. You and I were talking about, on our way walking in, so I spent some time on the phone today trying to get the IRS tax system to help me with something, and it's a subtle enough question. It was a really stupid one. I just needed to know where to mail a particular form. Nobody really has asked them that question very often. So they have all sorts of things about where to mail forms, just not this one. Right. And, it's sort of, you have to find someone who knows the answer, either there or somewhere else. Once that answer gets written down, put on the web, better search engines can find it. I went to Google and I searched around the form, and I found things that were pretty useful, but they still didn't answer the specific question I had until I found something, deep inside some set of instructions that said, by the way, this is where you should send this. I'm like, that's what I've been looking for. So why couldn't something have found that for the answer? Because we're still not there with the technology that can get deep inside that stuff, really match it to your needs, things like that. That's only a few years away. But again, when that happens, you're going to say, great, the thing does a better job of finding me where to mail my particular tax form. Does that make it smart? So I think we're going to see progressions of technology along many dimensions, but I'm still not sure we're ever going to be sort of sitting here, where the computer's sitting where I am now and you're having an interesting conversation that's not in some way contrived, limited to some domain, packaged, where what you and I might call creativity is going on, thinking about the answers in a new and different way that it hasn't, for not just pulling things from the web, things like that.
I'm willing to bet most people that be listening or watching this wouldn't know what you were talking about, the Alphago project. That's something I was aware of, was it 2-3 years ago? It beat the world's best player at Go. I never heard of the game Go up until a few years ago. And then I didn't watch that, the Netflix, Alphago, I forget what that's called on Netflix, but I saw that about 3-4 weeks ago and I was like, whoa. But it seemed like you said, like our eyeballs, like with Watson, our eyeballs look at that, Watson doing what he did on Jeopardy. I was like, okay, that's intelligence, right? Alphago, when we see that computer beat the world champion at seemingly the most complicated game out there with the most variables or numerically, it seems like intelligence.
Right. So 10 years ago, no, 11, I wrote a paper called Computers Play Chess, Humans Play Go, talking about why Go was such a challenge compared to chess. Because at that point, a computer had beat the world chess champion, which caused that same kind of fear moment. And now people look at it and say, well, of course computers play chess, right? Chess is a game that sort of, you look at it carefully, you say, of course a computer. The staggering thing is how well people still do against computers, how different they play and things like that. But when we were writing this book that came out last November, right, when we first drafted the chapter on game playing, we had why Go would be so hard and why we didn't expect to see any real progress in Go anytime soon. By the time the book was sort of being reviewed in January of the previous year, the computer had already beat I think it was the 600th best human.
The European champion.
Yeah,
guy,
so
right?
we rewrote it a little bit, but in chess, the time it took to go from when it was playing at master or grandmaster level to when it really beat the world's chess champion was years. So we figured, okay, we have some new. By the time the book got to galleys, we had to say it has now beat, at that point, it was the 4th best player, and there was no reason. So that happened very, very quickly. But the reason it happened was it turned out there's some aspects of Go that no humans had noticed that the computer was able to figure out. And the amount of computer power we have nowadays let some very clever people figure out some algorithms. Now, various people have made all sorts of interesting observations about that. For those who don't know, Go is played on a board that's 19 by 19, right? If you change the size of the board, particularly if you get bigger, the game gets much, much harder. So somebody raised the question, so if you took AlphaGo, which learned how to play 19 by 19, and put it on a 21 by 21 board, they have to be odd numbers, how would it do? And no one could answer the question. We don't really know well enough how it works. Now some new work, they've sort of taught it to teach itself kind of how to do it. So they had actually trained it off of top Go games and things like that. And now it bootstraps. But again, it's a game that's one-on-one, all the information's out there, things like that. So we recently, a colleague of mine named Simon Ellis, who was a former student of mine, and I have recently published a paper called Computers Play Chess, Computers Play Go, Humans Play Dungeons and Dragons. Because when you get into these kind of games that take creativity, games that take language, games that don't have sets of rules, and he's actually categorized a lot of those kind of games, you see something very different. You don't see the computer doing very well. You see all sorts of fun little pieces of it and lots of things out there with people working on it. But that's a much, much harder problem, because that gets at the stuff that requires really being able to think about what things line up with other things, how they do. Some of the examples he and I have used to be honest, we've tried to get a computer we've thought about how to play Dungeons and Dragons. You can contrive a situation. So you walk into a room and there's a ghost. Okay, so ghosts are supernatural. You kind of have a rule that supernatural is usually affected by silver. And, a few rooms ago, you saw a silver sword. Okay, let's go back and get the silver sword. But you're not really got a computer that kind of knows about ghosts and people and that, some of the implications of that. So a good dungeon master might have not only that you have to use that sword, but that ghost is actually a clue that, somebody who used to have a certain role was around here. And that would give you the clue that, hey, since that was the ghost of a bank keeper, the bank might be important or something like that. Those are the much harder kinds of things. And, the better and better the human is at making up the game and making it exciting, the harder and harder it is now for computers. Now, that doesn't mean we're never going to be able to play well or play even at a decent level, but it's just a very different skill set that has to be attacked in a very different way.
Now, I resisted playing Dungeons and Dragons my whole life because I saw it and I felt like it would be something I might get addicted to, and I was like, I don't have time for this in my life. So I don't know the rules of this, but if I'm under it, from what the little bit I do know, are the rules more fluid in Dungeons and Dragons
Right.
compared to, say, Go and chess,
Right.
where it's
the rules are completely fluid in the sense that there are some guiding principles and things like that. And to be honest, I'm not an expert, but I could talk about it.
Oh man, I was hoping you were.
So, but we won't.
All right.
No, my colleague is.
Okay.
He's my expert. He's been playing for years.
I need someone to explain it to me.
Yeah. But it's really pretty simple. So you and your team are going out on a quest, and there's somebody else in the game called the Dungeon Master, and he has made up the quest. So the next time you play, it's sort of his imagination or her imagination that determines what the game is about. So you are starting a sea voyage. You are in the mountains. You are up in the Adirondacks. You're starting in a basement in Troy, right? And then there are these characters and things. So you have to have some known information, or else it would be completely random. Although, again, there's more advanced levels and things like that. So certain kinds of monsters can show up in certain kinds of situations and things like that. But there's also a lot of creativity. So the player can come up with a solution that the dungeon master hasn't thought of. I need to get through that door. Okay, well, so standardly we would look for a key. We would look for something to break it down with, things like that. But, you can imagine somebody saying, I slip something under the door and I light it and that causes an explosion in the room and the door opens. Okay, so now the dungeon master says, oh, okay, given the world I've created, is that consistent? Could that happen? And then they could, would say, what are the probability and things like that. So it's creativity versus creativity as we would use the human sense of the term. And that's what makes that game. It's also all done through language. I mean, there's dice that are thrown for probabilities and that, but most of it is this character decides to try to do this thing in this way, and then the dungeon master determines what would happen. And some of those are standardized. The strong man, slashes his sword at something. But others of them might be much more subtle. He sticks the sword into the wall and then, flips something with it, and then people have it. So I'm told I've watched games, I've never really played that well, but I watch sort of, much of it is standard, and then all of a sudden some player will do something really creative and everyone else will get excited and the game will get really weird for a while. That'll sort of get back on track. And for the real players, that's the fun part, is when it gets into that interesting stuff, not when it looks like every other game.
When it breaks out of the rules that everyone agreed upon and somebody challenges those rules.
Well, it's not so much the rules. You're still within the rules. When it breaks out of the situations that are stereotyped, right? You go for a ride from Troy up 87 and turn off into the Adirondacks. Most of the time, what's pretty much predictable, things like that. Every now and then, You come to a really cool little store you've never seen before. You see a lake in the woods you've never seen before. You see a lake in the woods you've passed 100 times, but there's something drinking from it you've never seen, right? You know, I can keep making the situation a little more interesting, a little more complicated. It's those rare, interesting events that we love so much as people. This game allows that. And again, computers are better at that stuff that almost always happens. Right, not the thing that's the rare thing that all of a sudden you look at and say, "Wow, I've never seen that before."
What if the dungeon master is an AI? Would that make more sense if it has defined rules?
So the conversation we've had about that is an AI as a dungeon master's assistant in a sense. So the dungeon master has to actually know the knowledge that's in a whole lot of books. Right, because there are rules and there are things. So if you put this kind of character in a certain place, that means certain rolls of the dice will let certain things happen. So the dungeon master has to actually decide, how hard do I want to make it for those guys to get through that door? Is that really going to be a big part of the adventure or a simple part of the adventure? Okay, but it's that kind of decision making that the AI would have a very hard time doing. So if you gave the AI, here's the situation, you be the dungeon master. As long as nothing departed from the the usual play, you'd be fine. But again, the minute somebody does something creative that's never been, they haven't seen before, there's nothing in the books. The dungeon master has to use their experience, their intuition. You'll sometimes see very interesting conversations between the players and the dungeon master. So again, the game is well defined, but not rigorously defined the way a game of chess is, where the knight can only move this way, where, in Go, where you can only put your pebbles in certain positions, right? There's a lot more degrees of freedom, there's a lot more ways to go, and there's a lot more creativity, and that's really where the computer isn't ready yet.
Is anyone really trying to use the computer and AI for Dungeons and Dragons, or is this just a thought experiment that you guys are doing?
We started as a thought experiment. There are people trying it. There's nobody who's really built anything that has caused great excitement yet. There's been a lot of fun little toys, fun little things. The other thing is, like any game, like this. So something like Dungeons and Dragons or LARPing, live action role play, those become lifestyles as much as games. And I mean, whole hobbies.
Have you ever been to one of those? Like a LARP fest?
My daughter is a very serious LARPer, so I haven't been allowed to many LARP fests.
They're hilarious. They're fantastic. I've never met a group of happier people dressed up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful outlet for our creativity. And again, it's all about the creativity, the doing something interesting with your character. The last thing you want to do is take a character in a LARP and say, okay, this character is going to be a really boring person who only does the stuff that person in the real world would do, right? For the computers, it can be a lot easier to find this, to say, okay, so somebody who is a cleric, this is what they do. They perform marriages, and they go to they lead. The interesting thing in the LARP is you put that person in an unusual situation and say, what would they do, based on what the role player thinks that person would do. Getting back to that whole original story about computers and conversation, what Turing did. Turing actually said, it's not really a computer fooling you into thinking it's a human. It's a computer fooling you into thinking it's a different human, or it's a human, and a human versus a human So in his actual thing, you had a man pretending to be a woman and a computer pretending to be a woman. So now neither of them is actually a woman. They can't call on their actual life experiences in answering the questions, right? So there's an artificial, that's why it was originally called the imitation game. You had to be pretending to be something else. These games take that a lot further. This is what I meant before about just conversation may not be enough. You need these other aspects of it. But we're getting to, so computers are getting surprisingly good at being able to be in some of these situations. They're still not where people are finding them particularly interesting, exciting, etc., in these kind of things. Where things get interesting is when the human and the computer can work together. Okay?
Now I'm sure there's a ton of people that don't know what the Turing Test was. I didn't know about it until about a couple years ago. I'm like, okay, that's what that is. I heard the name Alan Turing, but basically, well, you explain it.
Right. Well, so the Turing Test is usually portrayed as you have somebody who's interacting via a keyboard, or nowadays it could even be a chatbot, with someone kind of behind a curtain. You don't know whether it's a human or a computer. And the claim is if you can't tell the difference, if most people can't tell the difference beyond random, then you would claim that computer won the imitation game and, was, quote, had shown intelligence. Now, the problem with that is in Turing's day, that was so hard to really imagine something that would do so well that they didn't really think hard about a lot of the details. How long do you have to talk for? Can you say it's, again, if I build something that's going to be only able to talk to you about baseball, that makes the job a lot easier for the AI, a lot harder for the person, but doesn't seem like it's a natural intelligence that would necessarily convey you that something smart. The other thing that Turing did have in there is what I was just discussing, is that it's not really fair to ask questions about the person itself and then ask the computer who's pretending to be a person. So it had to be a person pretending to be a different person. So after we've had this conversation and you've read some of my stuff, you go out and someone says, okay, I'm going to see whether Doug can pretend to be Dr. Hendler or not. And I'm going to put the two of them behind a curtain. I'm going to see who does a better job of pretending to be Dr. Hendler, Doug or the computer that listened to the interview and has read the papers and things like that. That's the trickier game.
So that makes me think that, so in Turing's day, when he came up with the concept, the Turing Test, he was, it was basically just keyboard is the only thing we could pick. So do we have our AI now, like an Alexa? If Alexa, or any kind of dictation program, would that pass this original Turing test as Alan Turing envisioned it at that time?
Modulo that it would have to. So right now, Alexa does not do very well at a conversation. It answers a question. Alexa, do this. Alexa, find that. Mm-hmm. Actually, Amazon has a big competition every year to try to have teams of students from around the world competing to make Alexa do a better job of actually doing a conversation. No one has done very well yet. They're interesting. They're fun to play with. You can find them on the Amazon site. Google has some similar things on Home. But again, conversation is much harder than question answering. And interesting conversation goes further. And then, of course, what kind of conversation do you want to limit Alexa to? Right? And do you want to specialize? So if I'm going to talk to something that's going to help me with a health problem, maybe I don't want it to be a world's expert at general stuff. On the other hand, if it can't understand, I'm worried about doing chemotherapy because I don't want to lose my hair. A problem you and I don't have.
It's kissing it goodbye.
I'm told some cancer patients have this issue.
Losing my hair has been so liberating because I don't have to think about losing my hair anymore.
I'm old enough, I forgot what it was like.
I remember being 17 and being like, dude, you got pretty awesome hair right now, but it's borrowed. You're going to have to give this back at some point. And alas, here I am.
But we digress. Yes. But take that little bit of conversation we just had, right? Now, notice that if we had just been talking over a teletype, I couldn't have made that joke, you couldn't have picked up on it, etc. It required seeing each other, knowing about baldness, knowing about historically that's an issue and things like that. So some people argue that for the modern Turing machine, you would need a video, audio, maybe even a robot. So some people have described what they call the robotic Turing test. Then other people have said, maybe even the conversation isn't really the right thing. So if you think about it, which is harder, to read a recipe or to make the cookies? Right? I mean, if you haven't had experience with the real world, making cookies is really hard to call it. So people call this common sense knowledge, the things that everybody knows and we don't think of as very interesting or very hard. But in fact, it's common sense knowledge that the computers have the most trouble with now and humans are at the best at. Just getting through the day, handling all the little things that happen all day long.
Because a computer might not even know where an oven would be. right? It wouldn't even know to go to the kitchen.
Well, even if you gave it a set of things. So there have been computers that have done chefing and writing recipes and things like that. But when you think about what's involved in making the cookies, mixing the dough and figuring out, does this feel right? Okay. No one ever trained you with something that says 3.76 pounds of pressure per square inch on your left fingers are what makes a dough correct, right? You have somehow, in playing with them, and in fact a good baker, I'm told, because I'm not a good baker, will be able to tell the difference between this kind of dough I want a little firmer than that kind of dough. This, I'm trying to get this effect today. I want something with these ingredients that different. When my wife cooks, depending which flours she uses, the dough feel. I help her with the dough. It doesn't feel the same to me. To her, she knows that, right? That's experience. That's learning. That's interacting. That's decision making. All of those things come together in many of the supposedly simple things we do as a human, right? But in fact, some of those supposedly simple things are very difficult for the computer.
Have you ever seen Ex Machina, the movie Ex Machina? All right, so just you talking about the dough and knowing what it feels like. Basically, my understanding of Ex Machina created this AI brain based on the Google of that movie, right? Like, it's just all this information, everybody's cell phone, all the information, the way people talk, and blah, 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 blah. So it seems like it was building the guy built a pretty awesome AI machine. But how would that AI machine, that woman, AI robot, how would she know when the dough was ready?
Well, that's in a sense what some people argue. Is in other words, that it's not enough to have the knowledge. It's having the knowledge, the ability to learn it over time, and the ability to use it appropriate, putting those things together. And that, of course, is a science fiction movie. There's nobody with anything close to that yet. In fact, if you look at, there's a robot called Sophia that was, kind of given citizenship by, I think, Saudi Arabia or something. Totally, very cool. It's got all sorts of facial expression, but very, very programmed. It would take you seconds of interacting with it to realize it's a robot. In fact, it's easier, and in fact, this is part of why people say that maybe having a robot there is required for the true Turing test, because speaking to something, it can get away with a lot of things it can't get away with in person. I don't mean it looked, it actually looked very human. It's rather inappropriate ways it interacted. So getting the gestures right to what's being said, when they're being said, ways. A lot of constraints can be put around things, a lot of interesting things. But so far, most of those, again, it's an evolving technology. But, I came here, we met on the street, we walked down some stairs, we came through some doors. Those are still big challenges for robots today. Right.
Well, you talk about in the book about driving your car that way, right?
Right. Right. Well, again, learning to do the physical parts isn't so big. Learning to figure out where you're going and what you're doing, to know. We talk about context. When do you know what something's right? So, one of the examples in the book, if you got that far, is when we talk about language. My favorite sign in the whole world. I was driving in Texas, and I saw a sign near a prison that says, "Hitchhikers may be escaping convicts." Okay? So the question is, do you pick them up? Because obviously the intent is to tell you don't pick up hitchhikers, right? They might be convicts who are escaping. But if you think about it, one interpretation could be, those hitchhikers are trying to escape from convicts. Let's pick them up and help them. Now, that doesn't sound, we as humans you'd say, okay, but that's an artificial case. Refugees may be fleeing oppression. Do you help them? Well, now that's syntactically, word for word, same kind of things. People to people, a verb escaping, a verb fleeing, or could be escaping oppression, right? Or even refugees could be escaping criminals, right? That one is very ambiguous depending on your political stance. Do I think that means they are criminals who are escaping, or do that means I think that there are criminals who are trying to hurt them? So again, we hear a lot about people coming from South America to escape gangs. They're coming, so they're escaping gang members. Okay, we as humans are so good at making those decisions and those judgments that we don't even think of them as interesting. But for a computer, those are extremely hard. Those require very subtle understanding of many things in the world and how to put it together. So if you think of computers as, sort of the next generation, even where we have them, they're going to be idiot savants. They're going to be able to do something really, really well, right? But not that whole broad stuff. So you'll be able to get a computer that will help make your helping humans solve tax problems so much easier. But they're still going to want to come to you, because if they use that robot themselves, that computer themselves, they don't know what questions to ask. I mean, I'm just guessing, because the last time I worked in a tax preparation office, I was 16, and looking at me, you can tell that's a lot of years ago. And
it was all paper.
We didn't have a lot of computers.
Not much to plug in, then. Yeah.
In fact, our biggest problem was that the mimeograph machine in the back occasionally would cause things to catch on fire, and you were burning people's tax returns, but which causes all sorts of issues. But I can't remember.
It's
so why would someone come to you? Partly because you know about this stuff, but also you're going to be able to make some judgments. You might say to someone, you have this kind of ambiguous case here, right? I think I could help you save some money, but you're taking a little bit of risk, right? You're not saying 0.7632 causes me to believe we should do this, right? You're sort of saying, you human, use your human knowledge to decide, are you willing to take this chance or not? Or I may, as an advisor, say, I can't advise you to do a certain thing, but a lot of other people, have done that and gotten away with it, right? So again, you have laws, you have vague areas around the laws, you have special circumstances, you have people and what their particular needs are, things like that. So all of that stuff, somehow this magical thing that sits between your shoulders and that brain of yours does a lot of the ability to put a lot of different kind of information together in a lot of different ways. The computers nowadays have access to way more, I'm going to call them facts, than you do. But the thing is, they're not very good at putting those facts together in those clever ways that you are. And when I say you here, it doesn't even have to be, you a smart person. It's just about any human. Right?
Is it this? It's patterns, right? It's pattern recognition.
Pattern recognition is a technical term, but pattern recognition was in some ways our excuse for why computers wouldn't do very well at Go. And now that they're playing Go good, we're doing. The problem is, once I get something down to where I understand it in a technical enough way that I can imitate it in a computer, we may get one of those impressive Jeopardy moments. But actually, when you look at it, you say, but that doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel how I do it. I'll give you an example that something that drives me crazy these days, and when I think about research. So I can ask you a question, and you can give me an answer. And then I say, how did you come up with that answer, right? If you use just what we know about brains and speeds and things like that, provably you came up with your answer faster than you could have come up with that logical set of things that describe the answer. So somehow you were able to process stuff en masse, get an answer, and then go back and justify it. Right? And clearly a lot of how we run our lives and do things is that, and very often we don't have to do that, go back and justify it. But in fact, that if that computer is going to do things by that reasoning process, a lot of things that we do without, quote, thinking about them, unquote, become very hard when you have to think about them, and it has to think about them. So again, we're very different than computers. And by the way, now I'm not even talking necessarily humans. A colleague of mine who's very famous in the learning community and I were having this discussion once. I said, well, if you could train a dog to do it, I could imagine you getting that kind of AI to get it. He said, I would be so happy if we could get an AI that could do sort of dog level intelligence compared to where we are now, because dogs are actually pretty good at doing a lot of interesting things.
What is it? They're as smart as like a 7-year-old kid or something? I feel I've seen that somewhere.
People say that stuff, but part of the problem is you get back into this issue of what do we mean?
That's right. My girlfriend and I
started the conversation.
We have a Shiba Inu, a little awesome Japanese dog, and it's depending on the list. It'll say top 20 smartest dogs. Sometimes it's on one list, other times it's not. But it always boils down to, it's like, what are we defining? Are we defining obedience? Are we defining compliance? Are we defining ability to survive? Because when I'm out with that dog, this is one of the reasons we got him is Shiba Inu are genetically closer to wild wolves than any other dogs. They're 98% wild wolf, and one of the oldest dog breeds. So when I'm out in the woods with him, he is surviving. Like, he's out there. He's not afraid of anything. He's looking for food. He's looking around. He's alert at all times. He's not afraid to get wet. Other times, if I'm outside with, say, I used to have a boxer, not so much in survival mode. Like, I don't count. If I ever lost that boxer, I'd be like, okay, he's probably going to be dead within a week or two. But the Shiba, if I ever lost him, I would be confident he would be able to survive. Right. So for me, that's intelligence.
Well, but it's a kind of intelligence. This gets back to that continuum thing. And this is why I when you say the 7-year-old, I immediately, come up with things. So if you have anyone who's listening who has a kid who's been 3, 4, 5 knows that when you read them a fairy tale, they love the story, and they know that some of that stuff doesn't happen in the real world. Now imagine trying to explain to your dog the difference between training it to do something in the real world and training it to do something in an imaginary world. This is tricky for humans too. So do you recall at the moment what the address was that Sherlock Holmes lived at?
No.
Okay, you're not a Sherlock Holmes fan.
No, I am. It's just not the thing I would retain.
You would have immediately come up with 221B Baker Street.
Nope.
If I'm not mistaken. All right. What did Sherlock Holmes do for a living?
A private investigator.
What was special about Sherlock Holmes?
Jeez, you're going down the. He was super smart, intuitive.
Right. Did Sherlock Holmes exist?
No.
Okay, so you just answered questions about where someone lived and what they did and why they were special. And by the way, they didn't exist. Isn't that contradictory information? No, because you're able to recognize the difference between the fictional world in which Sherlock Holmes lived, which interacts with the real world in which we live, but wasn't a real person, and other characters and other interactions and those things. And again, the younger kids, I do this with Harry Potter. They know Harry Potter or whatever the thing of the year is. Absolutely. But then all of them kind of believe in their heart of hearts that they wish it was true as opposed to they know it's true. And again, that ability to solve things in our head against a world that doesn't exist. Right? We don't have a way of even really talking about that right now for computers or for dogs.
Can we even describe what that is? It's just that ability. Can we even define that using our words?
Right. The first question you asked me, which we're still discussing long later, what is intelligence? This is part of what makes it so hard. And also, how much of it is consciousness? Do you have to know about your own existence? So there's arguments over whether dogs are really conscious in the sense of being able to, they know that they're clearly aware of their own existence. Are they aware of the level of existence of other things or not? What would that even mean, right? They pretty clearly can learn to interact with their owners and with other people in various ways. But again, are they doing it the same way we would, differently? We just don't know. I mean, a lot of that stuff is still way beyond philosophy, let alone us computer scientists building something. So even when we build that, quote, artificial dog, unquote, right now, if you ever look at the robot dogs, they're so far from real ones.
The ones coming out of Japan? I've seen a couple coming out of Japan.
Yeah, they're very cute.
They're cute. They're cool looking. Cute.
Some of them now are I saw a robot cat that really looks and acts like a cat. I could imagine people transferring affection to it who can't own a real cat, but they would know the difference.
But can you buy one of these now?
I have no idea what the commercial is. Right. I'd be surprised if you can't at a high price. But
it'd be like buying the first Tesla. It would cost like $1 million for the first AI cat.
I have no idea what the actual numbers are. It's probably less than a Tesla. It's probably Well, but I mean, there are people buying sex robots now in the tens of thousands of dollars.
Is that where we're going first?
So, there's people go first to where there are markets. And, very few people seem to want to spend a whole lot of money to have something that'll play Go with it.
Yeah. So there was it's define. Do you ever defining intelligence? Have you ever read anything about plant intelligence and the connectivity of plants and those neural networks? Seems to me that's something that just I've learned about in the last few years, and I read about like what's going on with plants. Let alone we can't even figure out ourselves. But now there's this whole plant world out there.
Yep. So again, gets us back to all of that stuff. What do we mean by intelligence, and is it just reactive? So at some level, are these things alive? Yes. Are these things alive and sentient? Well, now we're starting to just rename intelligence. But we tend to use the term sentient to mean kind of intelligent, but not necessarily human intelligence. In fact, sentient machines is a better term than intelligent machines, because intelligence tends to imply this other stuff, that you can tie your shoes, that you can learn things, as opposed to that you're aware of your existence in a certain way. I think as we learn more about the world in more ways, we find other things that are complicated. I used to say, what would be the ultimate challenge where, the president of the United States is forced to deal with something that says, get me the AI scientist, right? And I always said, like the alien spaceship lands and this thing comes out, and it's clearly half biological and half mechanical. And we want to know, is that is that thing intelligent, right? Who would you call? Well, philosophers can help, things like that. Could the AI guys help? But in fact, when we really look at what we're doing in AI, we're trying to some of us are trying to get at those definitions by saying, well, what's possible? What's doable? How do we get there? Others are really trying to build things to solve a problem, make some money, things like that. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between those. So when we look at plant intelligence, things like that, we get back into that whole conversation. What are we talking about? Things like that. How does a single plant compare to a clam? Okay, we would usually give the win to the clam, right? How does a network of these fungal things that are the largest life form on Earth compare to a clam? Who knows?
Yeah, that's the thing with the plants. We all seem confused. It seems like there's just little evidence that there's some kind of communication going on, like plants change their flavor or their color or emit an odor to warn other plants of something that's coming to eat them. That's just fascinating. That's just fascinating to me. Yeah, it sounds like it would fit our bill of survival. Like if I'm thinking in survival context, because I like to think in evolutionary terms sometimes, like, okay, intelligence exist in order to survive. If plants are communicating and telling other plants, hey, this is how you survive, like changing their flavor or emitting a smell, an odor that deters things from eating it, to me that should be a form of intelligence, for me at least.
Yeah,
but
sure. No, I mean, that's right. But again, you know, all these things get very complicated in very fun and interesting ways.
It's fun. It's fun. It's hilarious.
There are things that live down by the thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. I promise you, they exist. They survive way better down there than you would, right? We still have a lot of trouble calling those intelligent in the way we have been discussing. So again, survival is clearly an aspect of life and living and things like that. And so some people actually have tried to define intelligence, specifically evolutionarily, by the ability to sort of to move into more niches, right, via non-biological ways. That's a simplification. So humans live where it's very cold and where it's very warm, partly because we've learned how to put on clothes or take off clothes, as opposed to our body automatically changes to fit all these things, right? There's some body adaptation. So an Eskimo would clearly have a better cold tolerance than, well, I don't know about Troy, but certainly someone from the equatorial countries. But that equatorial person could put on a parka and the right pants and still exist up there on a cold night in Troy, New York. So, right, we kind of, so in a sense, the intelligence is that ability to be able to adapt, to be in those different places by shaping the world, by changing niches. We compete with another life form in a niche, so that's part of, the early evolution, right? These things want to eat those things, and who wins, right? The one that can beat up more of the other guys goes further. So, I mean, it's pretty clear what's ever inside our head has caused us to be able to fill up more of the world now, is arguably able to cause us to destroy that world and let it go back to other things, in which case, so again, philosophically, I'm not talking politically, but philosophically. So if the human race ended up destroying the human race and, cockroaches or something took over the world, would we say they were smarter? So that notion of evolution equals intelligence because you can fill more niches also starts to get complicated. So all these things are a lot of fun. Philosophers are not in any danger of going out of business anytime soon. AI just helps them.
Right, we're getting more information.
But at the technological end, there's really more and more capability we have that force us to have these conversations. And that's what I think is sort of interesting about AI right at this particular moment in time, because we are at a time where certain of the AI technologies are advancing to a point where they are going to come out into our world. They're going to have impact on jobs and on what people do and on how people do it in a way they haven't before. There's still an awful lot of stuff that no one is talking at this point about AI getting anywhere near anytime soon. And so part of why I wrote the book and part of why I do these podcasts is to help people see that this isn't an easy thing. There isn't one thing. It isn't, I'm not worried about the superhuman intelligent AI that's going to destroy the world anytime soon. I'd be much more worried about the guy who set off the nuclear alert in Hawaii if he had been on the other side of launching instead of preventing, right? Than I am about, an AI suddenly deciding that it wants to collect. I'm sorry. So there's a guy named Neil Bostrom who's the one who's really sounded a lot of the alert about super intelligent AIs, and his argument is, supposing you had an AI that got really obsessed with paper clips and wanted to own all the paper clips in the world, and in a sense, at some point, it would end up destroying a whole lot of people in its quest for the metal for the paper clips and things like that. And what he's saying is, sort of, if these things have non-human drives, how do we make sure that their non-human drives don't accidentally push them to do things that would destroy us? I'm not too worried about that anytime soon. First of all, look at how you laughed when I said a really intelligent thing who only cares about paper clips.
But it'd be a fantastic movie.
But also, it is the basis.
Sounds like a 1970s sci-fi shtick.
Yeah. But this guy is at Oxford and is quite famous. And, most of the arguments you hear from people like Musk himself, Elon Musk or Gates or Steve Hawking. I did a TED talk where I said, the great thing about this TED talk is I get to come out and disagree with the smartest man in the whole world, right? But I think when it comes to AI, Hawking is wrong. He's saying, the machines will start evolving and that's going to take over. And my answer is, what are they competing for? What niches are, so why are we scared of them? By the way, we still can turn them off. I think ever since the first AI movies came out, people have been keeping off switches around. And,
I saw an article just yesterday that AI has replaced aliens as our number one fear. And you see that in the movies. You see that just in conversation. And nobody talks about alien invasion so much anymore. We talk about AI taking over. You've got your Stephen Hawkings, your Elon Musks, who that's their concern. So yeah, that's what was such a relief about your book. I'm like, okay, it sounds like it's a symbiotic relationship. We need each other. We need computers to help our lives, but these computers are basically worthless without us keeping that on switch on.
Certainly for the foreseeable future, that's my belief. That there are things I worry about, people not understanding the technology. There's a lot of stuff going on right now about accountability and ethics and things like that. So, case that's gone all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court is judges are using software to help them make sentencing decisions. That software belongs to the company, so nobody's allowed to look inside that box and see what it's doing, right? If your life has been affected by one of those devices, can you appeal? Can you demand to see it? Your Constitution allows you to see your accuser. The current state of that is the courts have decided that as long as there's a human judge who is using that as only one of their decision criteria, then it's still legal, So no one has passed the issue of what happens if you actually tried to automate all the way down, things like that. And things will be affecting our lives. Things will be putting people out of work. You're a truck driver making an awfully good salary now, and now suddenly you drive the truck to the highway, you get out, the truck drives itself to where some other trucker gets in. You're not paid as much, right? And, I think, I forget the percentage, but somewhere between 2 and 3% of the U.S. workforce is long-range truck drivers.
It's a big number.
It's a very big number. And if you put a lot of them out of business or reduce their salary by a significant thing, they're not a populace that's well known for saying, "Oh, great, I'll just go do something else," right? Because it's got a cultural feature at the same time as a technical feature. So again, these things are going to be big changers, and we're going to see things that do affect us, and understanding what the bounds of these technologies are, when we should trust them, when we should trust them with the human, when we should trust a human without an AI, when we would like to see the human with an AI. So again, a colleague of mine feels that in another decade, you'll feel very uncomfortable going to a doctor who's not using an AI consultant. But you'd probably feel even more uncomfortable going to an AI that wasn't working with a human doctor. Does that eventually change? I don't know, but not.
In the movies it has.
Yeah, but but in the real world,
Yeah.
probably not certainly not in the next 10, 15, 20 years. There'll be big changes in that space, but probably not that change.
Who do you think's winning this race on the technological side? Is it Google, Facebook, Amazon, IBM, GE, some unknown company out of China or Japan? Is it a government? What's your best guess?
Yeah, so it's a good question. There's a lot of discussion about that right now. Part of it has to do with political factors that have nothing to do with the technology, how different countries approach companies and things like that. Over the next next decade, China has announced it is putting many billions of dollars into AI technology as a government to fund universities, to fund companies, to fund research. Okay, U.S. is largely pulling the government investment out of most scientific pursuits and turning that over to companies. Companies tend to have a shorter term outlook than kind of basic research and long-term research and things like that. So how will that affect China versus us? That's very hard to answer. I have certainly seen things that say that by year X, China will overtake the U.S. as the leader in this technology. And I've seen 2025, 2030, 2040, but I haven't seen a lot past that, assuming we don't suddenly change how we're doing funding, that they don't go broke, that the world is still around in the same form.
There's a lot of variables.
But assuming the kind of current trends, we don't see. Again, the U.S. is giving over to companies the ability to run a lot of this stuff, and some other governments are seeing this as a technology that they may be able to finally go beyond the USAM and become the innovator of the future if this is really going to be the world-changing technology. And of course, that gets into the whole question of whether it is or not. So, we live in very interesting times with respect to this stuff, and I think it's going to be changing year to year, day to day almost. But I think the basics are still the same. I've been doing this stuff for 50 years. There's technologies now that even 3-4 years ago I would have bet are impossible. But none of them are doing anything that I would have found I want to say surprising in the sense of breaking down the barriers that we've always assumed sit between the human symbolic ability and the computer's non-symbolic abilities. We still haven't seen computers that, so I haven't used that term before, but the thing that makes us able to have these conversations, things that makes us able to figure out how to solve problems without having them in the world, the thing that lets us think about Sherlock Holmes, or I often use, again, another one I use with my students is, you wake up in the morning and your car doesn't start. What do you do? Notice there's not an answer to that, right? There's sets of answers and you have to think about. But you don't go out and say, let me go outside, turn off my car, pretend it's the morning, and then see what I do, right? You somehow, within your mental capability, create that non-existent world of tomorrow with your car broken and are able to project what you would do in these different things. If I asked you your life goals for 20 years from now, you may not be able to nail them down, but I bet you could think hard and come up with some really interesting things. But you're not, you don't have to wait 20 years to see.
Imagination.
Yeah, I mean, again, imagination's one word for it. There's, I think that some of it's very simple, right? The symbolic ability that we had to tell the difference between escaping criminals and escaping refugees, right? We're good at value judgments, and we're really bad at putting numbers on those value judgments. And in fact, gambling and things like that take advantage of that. But, if I ask you to make a decision whether to push some button or not, and it's in a very artificial situation versus it's going to cause people to die, you're going to think a lot harder about pushing that button if you're most people.
What I'm gathering from you and your book is keep humans in the loop, and for the foreseeable future, that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
All right.
So certainly, yeah. To end on a strong term, what I'd say, and I've said it many times, is I believe in for the foreseeable future, humans plus machines are going to outperform either of them alone on many, many tasks, and understanding what those tasks are, how to make them work together well, and how to make it so that they're each doing the thing that's most appropriate for their kind of intelligence is really the challenge, and one that unfortunately isn't always what's being discussed about the future of this stuff.
Good. That's a great place to stop, and I'm glad you disagree with Stephen Hawking about something. All right. Professor Jim Hendler. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, man.
Bye-bye.
That was awesome.